it's certainly anything but boring out there on the political spectrum. Let's speak to Sir John Curtice, polling expert, Professor of Politics, University of Strathclyde. Nice to have you with us as ever, John. Look, it wouldn't have been that many years ago if we'd have played that amount of clips. You'd have thought, hang on a second, what's good? It's just Labour, it's Tories, it's the Lib Dems. We all know the rules. It's all changed.
You're quite right. Once tempted to say, and as I've followed that you wait not just hours but years for one new party to come along, and then all of a sudden you've got 4 or 5 of them turning up at your bus stop. But it's, in a sense, it's an indication of the way in which our politics has fragmented. We have no political party that seems at the moment to be able to claim more than 30% support. But equally, we have 5 political parties that have as much as 12%. And the truth is, the U Party on the left and Advance UK / Restore Britain, and my understanding is that those 2 parties are meant to be getting together. So maybe one bit of the fragmentation will go, are potentially a challenge on the other side of the spectrum. What, of course, we yet have to see is whether the Restore Britain / Advance UK phenomenon manages to take off. All we've got at the moment are hypothetical polling that says, if this party were standing, might you vote for it? And one poll I've seen suggests that about 10% of people said they might, mostly coming yes, and those people might otherwise vote for Reform, although Reform are actually still ahead in this poll, even with that there. I mean, equally, certainly, if you go look at Jeremy Corbyn's phenomenon, it's very, very clear that they are potentially looking for votes in much the same territory as Zach Polanski. Now, all that one can say so far is that it's not entirely clear that where the U Party is going to go, and we wait to see what Restore Britain can do. There are, and I think particularly we should remember, there are those major elections in Scotland, in Wales, and in England on May the 7th. If Rupert Lowe / Ben Habib's party doesn't make a significant showing in that, in terms of candidates, let alone votes, then it's difficult to see how far this is going to go, particularly if Reform end up confirming and cementing the position that the opinion polls they suggest, and they now end up with many more councillors. Equally, Jeremy Corbyn potentially faces the same problem on the other side of the spectrum.
Of course, it's only just over 10 weeks until May the 7th, which sounds extraordinary. So it is just around the corner. But of course, it's another 3.5 years until 2029. So, and that arguably is where the big decision is made, although decisions along the way are relevant. So lots of things can happen, of course, John, in that time. At the moment, if you went out onto the streets, and I say this not to be disrespectful to any individual or party here, if you went out onto the streets of the UK with a big clipboard and said, have you heard of Ben Habib and Advance UK? I honestly believe most people would say no. Similarly with Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain. Nigel Farage would, of course, poll rather differently. He's been around longer. Now, that might change. Zach Polanski, I'm sure, wouldn't get a great recognition factor either at the moment.
True. Yeah, all of that's true, though. Zach Polanski has certainly managed to do relatively well amongst those people who do recognise him. There's little doubt that it was his advent as the leader of the Green Party of England and Wales in September last year that helped to instigate the rise in support. I mean, I think, the truth is, we do have a by-election coming up in Manchester. Ben Habib's party is actually standing on that. There's also another a person who used to be allied with Reform who's also standing in that by-election. If indeed Reform were to end up losing that by-election by a very small number of votes, then perhaps we would have a particularly dramatic illustration of how the fragmentation of the right is potentially costly. But, but that will also give us some indication, frankly, of whether or not either of these phenomena have much prospect of doing well when they actually make contact with the electorate.
Indeed. And of course, with Reform UK, obviously a lot of former Tories are over there at Reform. Of course, there's another type of Tory that pathologically hate the idea of Nigel Farage and Reform. They're a different kind of Conservative, for the good or the bad, depending on where you sit politically, I guess. But if in those 3 years or so, as we approach 2029, if Ben Habib's party and Rupert Lowe's party did get together, and of that right-wing spectrum, they were kind of taking 20% of what would have previously gone to reform, then that could be significant.
Yes, it could. I mean, certainly we should bear in mind that, the polls don't entirely agree at the moment as to exactly how well Reform are doing. So YouGov at one end of the spectrum put it at about 24% and therefore, a relatively narrow lead over Labour. Others put it at 31% and still with a double-digit lead over Labour. Now, if the latter is correct, even if Advance UK and Restore Britain were to take a significant share of the vote off Reform might still be ahead. On the other hand, if it is narrow, then indeed, yes, then maybe the door is open for Keir Starmer to achieve a degree of recovery. Although remember, Labour at the moment barely have any kind of lead over the Conservatives. But again, I think maybe one thing just to say straight away, why at the end of the day have Reform been able to make the waves they have done? Essentially because of the charisma of Nigel Farage. Why, as I've already suggested, are the Greens doing as well as they did? The charisma of Zach Polanski. With all good grace to the gentleman in question, at the moment, neither Rupert Lowe nor Ben Habib have demonstrated that, what is frankly a rare political quality to be able to contact with the electorate. And that I think is certainly going to mean that that's going to give these parties an uphill task, particularly also many voters are probably going to be asking, well, what is it that you're in favour of that Reform aren't in favour of? Yeah. What is it that distinguishes you policy-wise? And at the moment, at least, I think probably 99.9% of voters would have very little idea on that, whereas most voters, whether they like or dislike Nigel Farage, do have a very clear idea of what he stands for.
Finally, John, if there was a general election tomorrow, I think the collective polls suggest Nigel Farage's Reform Party would win it. Once in a while, you have to pinch yourself and say how extraordinary is even that is a headline we thought we would never see, based on nothing more than a party with, 6, 7 MPs in the House of Commons are going to go on to win an election, really? Times have changed, of course. What would that victory look like, however? Are we talking about a thumping majority or something that would require some kind of coalition?
Well, the answer is we couldn't be sure. I think it's pretty clear that Reform will be ahead, unless, YouGov's polling proves to be markedly closer to the truth. But let's say it's closer to something like the average of around 30% that the polls put Reform at the moment. What you then have to bear in mind is if you look at the detail of those big mega polls that try to work out what's going on in individual constituencies, unfortunately for the Labour Party, they suggest that support for Labour, it will be falling particularly more markedly in constituencies they would be trying to defend, might just happen to the Conservatives in 2024. And in the light of that, Reform would probably pick up rather more seats than we might otherwise anticipate, and that could indeed be enough to lead them to a position where they get an overall majority. It would be an unprecedented outcome. Previously, no party has come anything like close to winning a parliamentary majority on just 30% of the vote. But in our fragmented politics, a party which, even with 30%, which is well ahead in the polls, could still manage to achieve that feat.
Indeed. John, great to have you on with us again. Thank you, Sir John Curtice, polling expert and Professor of Politics, University